My mother had been gone for 11 days when I got the call from the insurance company. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out the travel thermos she carried everywhere, the scratched silver one with the dented lid that she'd had since before I was born, and refused to replace because she said it kept coffee hotter than any new one she'd ever tried. I was rinsing it out for no reason that made any practical sense. She wasn't going to use it again. I knew that. I just needed something to do with my hands. The woman on the phone introduced herself as a senior claims processor. She said she was calling as a courtesy, which is a phrase that in my experience means someone is about to tell you something they'd rather not. She said that a beneficiary change request had been submitted on my mother's life insurance policy 6 days prior. The date on the form was 3 weeks before my mother passed. The signature, she said carefully, did not match their records with precision. I set the thermos down on the counter and asked her to repeat that. She did. I told her I would call her back within the hour, and I did not move from that spot in the kitchen for a full 2 minutes. You need to know something about my mother, Donna, and the life she built in that house on Sycamore Court. She bought it on her own, which was not a small thing for a woman in a town like Millhaven in 1991. She was 31 years old and newly separated, and she walked into that bank with her own pay stubs and her own credit history, and she sat across from a loan officer, and she did not leave until he had given 4. That was my mother's entire approach to everything. She was polite and she was patient, and she did not leave until she had what she came for. She worked as a bookkeeper for 23 years at a regional manufacturing company. She was not someone who talked about money openly, but she was someone who understood it quietly and completely. When I was 16, she sat me down at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook, and she walked me through a basic budget the way some mothers walk their daughters through recipes. Line by line, income, fixed expenses, savings, then everything else. She said, "The first thing you protect is your future self." I wrote it down. I still have that notebook somewhere in the back of the closet upstairs. My sister is 5 years older than me. She is the kind of person who walks into a room and changes its temperature louder, bigger, more immediate than anyone else present. She married her husband 11 years ago at a venue she couldn't afford, with flowers she couldn't afford, and a photographer she paid in installments that I only know about because my mother quietly helped cover the last 2 when my sister stopped returning the photographers' calls. Her husband is charming in a specific way that makes people feel chosen. He has the laugh of someone who's used to being the funniest person in the room, and the attention span of someone who's never had to stay long enough to deal with consequences. I watched them for years. I watched them borrow money from my mother for a camper they sold 2 summers later. I watched my sister convince my mother that a particular piece of jewelry had sentimental value she'd never mentioned before my mother's health started declining. I watched them spend holidays in the house, eat my mother's food, take the guest room for granted, and then drive home and not call for 6 weeks. I watched my mother make excuses for them with a patience I did not fully understand until she was gone, and I understood that she had made those excuses because she was afraid of the alternative, which was admitting that one of her children was someone she had to protect herself from. I am a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company. I have been for 7 years. My mother named me as her insurance beneficiary when she first took out the policy. She named me as the executor of her estate when she revised her will 2 years before her diagnosis came back with the kind of news that changes the shape of everything. My sister did not appreciate either of those decisions. My mother's illness moved the way illnesses do when they are serious, but not immediately catastrophic in slow increments that give everyone time to adjust and dread and grieve in overlapping cycles that never quite synchronize. She had good months and bad months. She had days where she was entirely herself, and days where she would lose the thread of a conversation and look at you with a brief flicker of uncertainty before finding her way back. My sister started calling more during the bad months. The calls were framed as concern. She wanted to know whether my mother had thought about updating her accounts, whether the house was in good repair, whether the mortgage was fully paid off. It had been for 4 years, which my sister knew, but she asked anyway. She asked whether my mother had considered consolidating her accounts to make things easier for everyone. I noticed she used the word everyone with a casual expansiveness that was doing a lot of work. My mother passed on a Thursday morning in March. The house was quiet and early lit, and the crabapple tree in the backyard was just starting to bud, which happened every year around the same time and which my mother had tracked on a paper calendar in the kitchen for as long as I could remember, marking it with a small circle in red ink. She had circled it in February, already anticipating it, the way she anticipated everything she cared about. My husband was with me. He had rearranged his entire work schedule to be there, and he held my hand through all of it, and he did not say anything that wasn't exactly right. My sister arrived later that afternoon. She came with her husband. and she came with an energy that I recognized immediately. Not quite grief, but something adjacent to it. Something that wore grief's clothes but moved differently underneath. She looked around the house when she came in the way you look at a place you're calculating rather than remembering. She touched the door frame of the living room with her fingertips. She asked, in the first hour, whether I had spoken to any estate attorneys yet. I said I was handling it. She said she just wanted to make sure we were doing everything correctly, that there were a lot of decisions to make and she didn't want anything to fall through the cracks. I said I understood. Over the next 4 days, she asked me whether the house would be listed soon, whether the life insurance had already been filed, whether my mother had any accounts I wasn't aware of, whether I was sure the will was the most recent version. After each conversation, she would nod and say she was just trying to help. Within 20 minutes of each conversation, I would hear her on the phone in the back bedroom, her voice low and precise the way people's voices get when they are talking about something they don't want overheard. I am a claims adjuster. I know what it sounds like when someone is exploring options. On the third night, after her husband had gone to bed, my sister found me alone in the kitchen. She had that way of arriving that made it seem accidental. She just needed a glass of water. She just couldn't sleep. These things just happen. She leaned against the counter and said that I had been carrying so much and that she was worried about me. She said that the two of them could help with the estate process if I needed it. She said that her husband knew a financial advisor who worked specifically with estate transitions, and that sometimes having someone handle the accounts and paperwork from a distance made it less emotionally complicated. I thanked her for the offer. She smiled and said she just wanted to make sure everything was handled right. She left the water glass on the counter untouched. I lay awake that night and I went back over every conversation from the past 4 days with the methodical attention I apply to claim files when something doesn't add up. The questions about the house value, the interest in whether the will had been updated, the offer to help manage accounts, and, underneath all of it, something I had been noting for longer than just the past 4 days. My sister's financial situation. I had not gone looking for the information. It had come to me in pieces, the way information does when you are paying attention and people are not as careful as they think. Her husband had mentioned a business deal at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, mentioned it in the past tense and changed the subject quickly. My sister had called my mother for a loan 8 months prior that my mother had quietly mentioned to me, not as a complaint, just as information. A mutual friend had mentioned, once, that their mortgage was the kind of stress that doesn't stay at the table when you're trying to eat dinner. My mother's estate, the house, the savings, the life insurance, was exactly the kind of number that could solve someone's problem for a while, or feel like it could. The insurance company called on day 11. I asked the claims processor to hold the file and call me back that afternoon. Then I sat down at my mother's kitchen table with the legal pad I'd been using for estate notes, and I wrote everything out in order, the same way my mother had taught me to write out a budget. What I knew, what I could verify, and what I needed to do next. I called my contact at the policy underwriter. I called the county clerk's office. I called the estate attorney who had helped my mother revise her will and who had been nothing but thorough about every document involved. I pulled every record I had access to on the policy, which was considerable because of my professional standing in the industry, and because I had been the named beneficiary for 6 years and could request documentation accordingly. The beneficiary change form that had been submitted listed my sister as primary beneficiary. It was dated 3 weeks before my mother died. My mother at that point had been in and out of clarity in ways that her medical records documented specifically. The signature on the form was close, but close is not the same as right when you have 6 years of comparison documents and a professional eye for exactly this type of discrepancy. The form had been notarized at a shipping and print shop 40 minutes from my mother's house, in a town where, as far as I could determine, my mother had never been in the last decade. I sat in the parking lot of the estate attorney's office, and I did not move for a while. Then I called my husband. I told him what I had found. He listened without interrupting and then said, "What do you need?" I told him I needed 2 days. He said to take whatever I needed. I went to work. Not to my office, but to the work itself. I pulled the original policy documents. I cross-referenced signatures with everything on file. I contacted the notary licensing board. I had a conversation with the claims processor, a longer one this time, a professional conversation in which I laid out what I had found, calmly and in sequence, and asked her to place the submission under formal review. She said she already had. She said, off the record, that she had flagged it herself before calling me because something had not sat right with her either. I went to my mother's bank. I was the named executor. I had the death certificate, the will, the letters testamentary, every document in order. I sat down with the branch manager and we went through the accounts together, and I ensured that every account was properly titled and properly frozen for estate proceedings in accordance with my documented authority. Then I filed a formal fraud report with the State Insurance Commissioner's office. My attorney helped me draft it. It took most of an afternoon. I left the pending claim in review. I did not call my sister. I went home and I made dinner with my husband, and we sat at the table and talked about other things. His work, a book I'd been meaning to read, the crabapple tree in my mother's yard that I had decided I was going to try to transplant to ours when the time was right. I slept that night better than I had since my mother passed. The call came 9 days later. I was at my desk when my phone lit up with my sister's number. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Her voice had a quality I had not heard in a long time. It was the voice she used when she was trying to sound composed about something she was not composed about, which meant it was slightly too even, slightly too careful, with an edge underneath it that she couldn't quite sand down. She said that she had received a letter. I said that I expected she had. She said she didn't understand what I had done. I told her I had done my job. I said I was the named beneficiary. I said I was also the executor of the estate. I said that when a beneficiary change request is submitted on a policy that I am professionally familiar with the processing of, and when the signature on that request does not match 6 years of documented comparison signatures, and when the notarization takes place at a facility 40 minutes away, in a direction my mother had no reason to travel, I take an interest. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the form had been my mother's idea. She said my mother had mentioned it to her, had wanted to make things more fair, and that she had just been trying to carry out what my mother intended. I said that my mother's intentions were documented in a legally executed will, a will that had been prepared by an attorney, signed in a law office, and witnessed by 2 people who were not related to our family. I said I had a copy of that will. I said my attorney also had a copy. More quiet, I continued. I said I also had, in front of me, a copy of the beneficiary change form, a comparison of the signature against 6 years of documents on file with the insurance company, a record of the notary whose license number appeared on the form, and a report I had filed with the State Insurance Commissioner's office 14 days ago. I said the Commissioner's office had opened a review. I said that a finding of intentional misrepresentation in a life insurance claim is a felony in our state. I heard her exhale. I said I had 2 options written out, and that I would need her and her husband to come to my attorney's office to discuss them. She asked why her husband needed to be there. I said because his name came up in the review. She did not ask anything else after that. They came 3 days later. My attorney's office is in a low brick building downtown with a parking lot in the back and a waiting room that manages to be both professional and unremarkable, which I think is exactly the right quality for a room where difficult things get decided. My husband drove me. My sister and her husband were already in the parking lot when we arrived, standing next to their car, not talking to each other. My attorney met us in the conference room. She had set up the table the way she always did for difficult meetings, 2 folders, 2 chairs on each side, water in the center, nothing extra. She greeted everyone by name and did not editorialize and sat down. I slid the folders across the table. I told them that folder 1 was the complete documentation of the estate proceedings, including every account, every asset, the beneficiary designations, as they stood on the original policy, and the executor actions I had taken, all of which were fully within my documented legal authority. I told them that folder 2 was the review file, the beneficiary change submission, the signature comparison, the notary records, and the correspondence with the insurance commissioner's office, along with the draft formal complaint my attorney had prepared for submission to the county prosecutor. My sister's husband opened his folder. My sister did not open hers. She looked at the table. I said I had 2 options on the table, written out clearly, because in my experience, clarity prevents later disagreements about what was agreed to. Option 1. They signed a document relinquishing any claim against the estate or the insurance policy. In exchange, I would not pursue the fraud complaint through the prosecutor's office. The insurance claim review would be closed without finding. They would receive the portion of the estate my mother had specified for my sister in her will, which was $8,000, and my mother's sewing machine, which my sister had always said she wanted, and I believed her on that one particular point. Option 2. I submitted the complete file to the prosecutor's office, allowed the insurance commissioner's review to proceed to its conclusion, and administered the estate entirely through the courts, which would generate a public record and take the better part of 2 years. My sister's husband looked at the folder for a long time. He had an expression that I recognized from adjusting claims, the expression of someone who has realized that the version of the situation they had been operating from is not the version that is documented. my attorney said, quietly. Pages 3 and 7 need signatures and initials. My sister's husband reached for the pen. My sister sat very still for another moment. Then she said, "This isn't what she would have wanted." I looked at her. I thought about what I wanted to say, and I said the thing that was true instead of the thing that was easy. I said, she would have wanted her wishes followed. They are, to the letter. My attorney slid the pen across the table. My sister picked it up. She signed where she was asked to sign. The sound the pen made on the paper was the only sound in the room for a moment. And then my attorney thanked everyone for their time in a tone that indicated the meeting was finished. We drove home. My husband didn't ask me how I felt until we were inside and the door was shut and the particular quiet of home had settled around us. Then he looked at me in the way he looks at me when he is waiting to understand something, without pressure, without direction. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I thought about my mother at that table with the spiral notebook, explaining to teenage me how money works and why protecting your future self is the first obligation, not the last. I thought about her at the bank in 1991 with her pay stubs and her credit history and her refusal to leave without what she came for. I thought about her tracking the crabapple tree on the paper calendar, red circle in February, because some things deserve to be anticipated and marked. I said, I think I'm okay. And I meant it the way okay means not finished grieving, not without loss, but intact. Still standing in the kitchen my mother bought for herself and the life she built for herself, with someone who had asked me what I needed and meant it, which is not a small thing. The estate closed 5 months later. The house came to me, which had been in the will from the time my mother revised it, stated plainly and without ambiguity, because my mother was a woman who did not leave room for misinterpretation in anything that mattered. The insurance policy was paid out to me as the named beneficiary on record, which had never changed because no change had ever been legitimately authorized. My sister received the $8,000 and the sewing machine. I know she took the machine because I helped load it into her car, which I did because it had been my mother's and my mother had wanted her to have it, and some things you do simply because they were asked of you by someone who is no longer there to ask. Her husband did not look at me when we carried it out. I did not require him to. What surprised me in the months afterward was not what I expected. I had expected to feel relief more cleanly than I did, or anger in some resolved and finished way. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, a kind of clarity that I didn't have a good word for. A sense of having been shown something about myself that I had suspected but not confirmed. My mother had not been naive about my sister. I understood that more clearly after she was gone. She had known, the way parents often know things they cannot act on without cost, what her older daughter was capable of when money was involved and options felt limited. She had made her choices anyway. She had left the sewing machine to my sister in the will. She had also named me as executor and beneficiary, which was its own kind of message. She had trusted me with everything she'd built because she knew I would do what she had done at 31 years old in that bank. Stay at the table until the right outcome was on paper, regardless of how uncomfortable it was to be the person who stayed. I think about that sometimes when I sit on my mother's back porch, which I do most weekends now when the weather allows. My husband makes coffee in the kitchen. I bring it out to the porch in the silver thermos, the scratched one with the dented lid, because it does keep coffee hotter than anything new I've tried. And because carrying something forward from someone you loved is not the same as being stuck. I look at the crabapple tree and I think about the red circles on the February calendars, all those years of small anticipations marked and kept and returned to. My mother spent her whole life believing that you could build something solid and that building it right from the beginning was the only protection that actually held. She was correct. I've spent 7 years in this industry watching people find out, at the worst possible moments, that the paperwork they thought was in order was not, that the signature that seemed fine was not, that the assumption they'd made about how things were set up was not accurate. Attention is not the same as suspicion. Preparation is not the same as distrust. Knowing how the process works and making sure your documents are right is not hardness. It's what you owe to the person who put you in charge of what they built. My mother chose me as executor because she knew that when the time came, I would be the person who understood the difference between keeping a door open and leaving a vault unlocked. Grace is something you extend freely. It doesn't mean you hand someone the keys to everything you were trusted to protect and hope they'll find their own conscience about it. Sometimes protecting the right things means doing the uncomfortable thing, the thing that doesn't make you popular at the table, the thing that looks from the outside like it lacks mercy. I don't think it lacks mercy. I think it's the most precise form of loyalty I know how to offer. Loyalty to what she asked of me. Loyalty to what she built. Loyalty to the 31-year-old woman who walked into a bank and did not leave without what she came for. and who taught her daughter, at a kitchen table with a spiral notebook, that your future self is the first thing you protect. The crabapple tree is going to need to be pruned this fall. I've been watching it the same way she watched it, noting when the buds come and when the fruit sets and what the canopy looks like by September. I got a calendar. I've been marking it in red ink. I think she would find that funny and appropriate and probably also a little sentimental, in the way she found sentimental things acceptable only when they were also practical. The thermos keeps the coffee hot until the second cup. She was right about that too.